I would like to welcome Lawrence Hill here today. Thank you for joining us.
You're welcome.
We're here to talk about your most recent book, the Book of Negroes. It is it's a visceral and provocative story of a young girl, Aminata. She was stolen from her African village of Bayo and taken on a ship to the U.S. where she was to face a life of slavery. We've kind of divided the interview into three parts. We're going to talk about the man, the book, and the message. So I was going to start us off and ask a couple questions about you.
Certainly.
So the book came out just a couple weeks ago, and you've had tons of media attention. What has some of the reaction been?
Well, for the most part, it's been positive. I've given readings and audiences around the country, some of which were predominantly white, and others of which were predominantly black, and others of which were really quite mixed in terms of the demographic and the racial makeup. But on the whole, I've been really quite blessed with this one, and it's really sort of shot out of the gates and had an overwhelmingly positive reaction. One guy on the air in Vancouver really blasted me for using the word Negroes in the title. He was quite upset about that in the radio interview at CKL Radio in Vancouver. But other than that one guy, people and reviewers and listeners, readers seem to have been really taken with the book more intensely than any other book I've written in the past.
It seems like it's easy to become overwhelmed when taking on a complex and sensitive project like this, like the Book of Negroes. Did you have any times throughout the 5 years it took to write the book? Did you have any moments of self-doubt?
Completely. I think most writers have a lot of self-doubt, if they're being honest, with others and with themselves. And 5 years, even if you're hugely successful commercially or something, which I'm not, certainly in my past life as a writer, 5 years to be alone inside your own thoughts is a long time, and it's almost an act of religious faith. And I have no religion, so my faith is literature. To spend alone in your own head, imagining yourself climbing through this dark tunnel or through this valley that's shrouded in mist, hoping to get out the other end one day. It's a long time to not know if what you're baking up is going to be worth something inedible or if it's not. So, sure, I had a great deal of doubt. It was a hugely ambitious story, told from a woman's point of view from start to finish. She carries the entire novel, which was new for me. So yeah, I had a lot of doubt. Now, I think that self-doubt, to a certain degree, can be a good thing because it makes you work really hard to compensate for what you perceive as your own weaknesses, and it certainly was a motivating factor for me. But yes, I had a lot of doubt about my ability to pull this off because it was a big, ambitious novel.
But throughout the writing process, you had a pretty solid support system around you. You have a wife and 5 children.
I do have a fantastic support system, and it means the world to me. And just even having little kids who know how passionate I am about what I do makes me feel richer and stronger, and that much more having a reason to carry on, because they need to see Dad doing something that he's passionate about. And there are so many people in this world who hate what they do. And I've had a lot of jobs over the years, so I know from personal experience, whether it's being a dishwasher or a speechwriter or canoe guide or anything else, I know how many people can't stand what they do, and at times I've hated the jobs that I've had, and so I feel really rich to be able to do what I do and to do it on a full-time basis. And for me, the signal of being a successful artist isn't really how much money you're bringing in, but can you do what you love to do and spend most of your time at it? To me, that's a sign of success as an artist. So I do feel I have tremendous support systems, and the kids and my wife, make me feel stronger and more passionate even about what I do.
You've said in previous interviews that often slavery is seen as Black history, and that in fact it's part of American history and part of Canadian history as well. As well as being your own labor of love, what is the greater significance of this book, or what's the wider context to see it in?
Well, I think that I'm hoping that a reader and the readers around the world and certainly across Canada would take away from it a sense of appreciation of of a woman's story, you know, in the 18th century, back and forth across the ocean in incredibly turbulent and difficult conditions. It's a story of courage and perseverance and inner strength, regardless of one's race. It's a woman's story. It's also, I guess, a story that attempts to dramatize some of the lesser known or perhaps almost entirely forgotten aspects of Canadian history and of world history having to do with black peoples. And if blacks have come to Canada from, say, in this case, the United States as loyalists with the after having served the British in the American Revolution, and then find conditions in this country so repulsive and oppressive that they have to turn around and leave 10 years later to go to Africa, that tells us a great deal, not just about them, about black people, about black history, but about Canada. That this is a country that did welcome black migrants, but in some cases made life so miserable for them that they felt it was better for their own interests to turn around and leave and to vote with their feet and go somewhere else. And so that tells us, I think, a lot and reveals a great deal about Canadian history, and I think it should engage and be interesting to all Canadians. I certainly think it's a fascinating slice of Canadian history, and one that's almost completely unknown from coast to coast, and that I didn't really know about either until I began researching the novel. So I guess part of it, of course, I mean, I'm an entertainer and a dramatist, and I want to create a story in a fictional bubble that's really enticing and, you know, seductive for a reader to draw that reader in. But I also hope that the reader would take away an appreciation of a woman's courage and perseverance in the 18th century, as well as a deeper appreciation of some of the more forgotten but fascinating elements of black history in Canada.
Extensive research, I have a feeling, was done while this book was in the works. How did you, or in what sense did you allow yourself to relate to the characters that you've created in this book?
Well, I really tried to relate, and it's easy to set up cardboard characters that are, you know, despicable and just do horrible things, and it's harder to create a person who's doing awful things, but who also has a shred of humanity, or many shreds of humanity. It's a greater challenge, and I think it's more interesting for a reader if, at least often, people who are doing horrid things are also interesting, complex people. I don't really believe in devils and angels, and I don't really believe that any human being is all goodness or all evil. I think that maybe we carry a bit of these things in all of us, and we have to fight off our baser instincts and try to become more noble people. And so to watch a human being struggling with his or her own flaws, and maybe even still perpetuating serious mistakes or abuses against others is interesting, and the struggle itself is interesting. And so, for instance, in the case of Solomon Lindo, who owns Aminata for a while, I was interested in the struggle, the moral struggles that he engages in as he's going about his life.
Yeah, he was an interesting character because he saw himself outside of the other slave owners because he was Jewish. So I thought another interesting thing in the book was the point where the Americans were fighting amongst themselves, and the Americans were fighting against enslavement that was brought on by the British.
Yes, and of course from the perspective of a black person who's enslaved or who's run from slavery in the 18th century, to hear white American rebels who talking about their enslavement at the hands of the British for economic reasons, they have to pay taxes to King George III and so forth. So it sounds a little hollow and rings a little bit superficial. It's not very convincing to a fugitive slave to listen to white people complain about their enslavement. So there's a level of irony that runs deep, you know, in the book. But on the other hand, of course, the British who became Americans who sought their freedom were entirely, I think, justified to fight for the freedoms, economic and social, political freedoms that they fought for. So it's a very interesting issue, and it's again layered because they were fighting for their independence while repressing the independence of the very people they kept enslaved.
The Book of Negroes is not your first book. Among the others, one is A Deserter's Tale, which is non-fiction, and it's a story of a man who goes to Iraq feeling very patriotic and comes back totally disillusioned. And you've also worked on a documentary, Seeking Salvation, which is the history of the Black Church in Canada. How has writing changed for you over the years?
Well, you know, Jessica, I've been writing really since I was 6. I've been writing with some passion since I was 6, and I started writing short stories and then ripping them up and rewriting them again and ripping them up and rewriting them again when I was about 14. So since my early teen years, I've been writing fiction and doing all the things that writers do. And I'm 50 now, so that's about 36 years of active writing. And it's my single working passion. There's nothing else that I'm really passionate about working-wise. It's just writing. I guess one of the things that's changed is that I've had to come to realize over the years that I've had to write in various genres in order to survive. Unless you're wildly successful, just unbelievably successful, if you want to live a basic, average, middle-class life and have any dreams of supporting a family, you're going to have to write in various genres, not just the one that you're most passionate about, which in my case is a novel, but sometimes fiction or journalism or film or other things. And so I've written just about every kind of thing except for advertising, over the years. I was a speechwriter for some years and a journalist and written a couple film scripts and a number of, hundreds of magazine and newspaper articles and nonfiction books as well. So one thing that's changed is just that I've had to come to accept and embrace the idea that I have to write in different areas. I can't just sort of indulge myself into the one thing that makes me most passionate, which is, of course, fiction. So that's changed a bit as I've come to terms with that. And I've seen the interdependence of these. But also, I've become more fiercely wedded to my own passions and less willing to compromise on the things that I write. I'm sort of fed up with compromise. I've had to do it all my life, and I feel really fortunate that, for the most part, when I write a book, it's mine, and I don't have to do anything but be faithful to my own passions and to my own beliefs and dig and dig and dig and push and be true to myself. And not that many people, really in other art forms, can feel as independent as a novelist can. And so it attracts me a great deal for the room it leaves for personal independence and sort of personal creativity. So that's changed in that I've become more adamant and insistent that I'll sort of do it my way, and I'll do it mostly alone if it's possible. And often I think the team approach or the multi-layered approach, if you have many people working on a project together like a film, ironically can stifle creativity that they can erupt if just one soul can run free and run riotously free. And so I'm quite interested in just individual, creative genius and finding ways to let that simmer up and kind of explode on the page.
When you sit down and write anything, do you have readers in mind? Like, who do you write for?
I really write for myself, Jessica. I think it would be very paralyzing if I felt that I had to satisfy or write for an audience, whether it's a racial group that I had in mind, which I don't, or a gender that I had in mind, or some socioeconomic group, or my parents, or somebody. It would just be stifling because I'd be worrying about pleasing them. And surely, I believe that if I just try to be true to my own self and my own muses, and if I try to write to my own standards, which are really, as exacting as I think anybody else is, that I have to hope that if I'm true to my own self and write honestly and truly, that somebody else will be interested in that too. So I write to satisfy myself. I hope that other readers will leap in and find it engaging, so I want to attract other readers, but I try to just think about myself when I write, and if I worried about others, I think I'd really be tied up in knots and I wouldn't feel free.
Well, thank you. I'm going to pass it over to Nikki.
Thank you, Jessica.
Well, let's talk specifically about the book, the Book of Negroes. What inspired you to write the book?
Well, Nikki, I guess there was a historical nugget that came to mind that planted the seed of the novel, I guess, in my own heart. And that was that when I was reading and researching about the black royalists, these are the black people who came from the United States, fled the United States after the American Revolutionary War, spent 10 or so years in Nova Scotia in the 1780s, and then many of them turned around and left and went to Africa in 1792. So this is the movement of blacks into Canada and out of Canada late in the 18th century. I learned that many of the migrants, these black Nova Scotians, these adventurers, as they call themselves, who left Nova Scotia and went to Africa, weren't just going to Africa, they were going back to Africa. Many of the people in these 15 ships sailing from Halifax to Sierra Leone in 1792 had been born in Africa. And when I learned that, I sort of did that wow thing, and I stopped and asked myself, what kind of life might a woman have led You know, if she'd been not just on one of these ships sailing from Halifax to Sierra Leone, but born in Africa and finding herself late in life returning to her home continent, how might she have lived? How might she have been abducted? Where may she have been born? How on earth did she end up in South Carolina, and what might have taken her to Nova Scotia? Can I fill this life in, and can I imagine and dramatize this fictitious life sitting on a true historical foundation? And so what inspired me was the discovery that some of the adults sailing from Halifax to Sierra Leone in 1792 had actually been born in Africa and were returning to their continent after many years of enslavement and then liberation in the Americas.
And this book was a 5-year process. What kind of research or how much research went into it?
A huge amount. And I think often, and I will admit, I think many of us, myself included, use research as a crutch to maybe escape the hard task of writing. And you can research until the cows come home, but it won't get any pages written. So you really do have to decide when you're going to cut this out and put down the 49th book you read on the history of blacks in South Carolina and just start working and writing. And so it is easy to lose yourself in more and more and more research, and you do have to sometimes draw some arbitrary lines. But the novel is set in various locations. It's set in Africa, and then it's set in South Carolina, both in rural and urban South Carolina. It's set in Manhattan. It's set in Nova Scotia, and then back to Sierra Leone, and then it's set in London. And so and it follows black people and black communities in each of these places, and sort of from the mid-1700s to the early 1800s. And so I had to understand the lives of black people in each of these parts of the world in that time frame. So what did that involve? It meant reading, well, certainly over 100 books and many, many, many scholarly articles about different aspects of black experiences in each of these places. The most interesting of all the books that I read as research were the narratives written by blacks and whites who were living in the 18th century, writing their life stories or writing about what they were doing, whether they were letters, memoirs, or books of some other sort. Letters or books and memoirs by blacks and whites living in the 18th century were the most colorful, detailed, insightful bits of research that I came across. So I read every memoir and narrative that I could, especially slave narratives. People sort of like my character, Aminata, who managed to be, had been enslaved and they managed to get their freedom and acquired enough literacy to write their stories. There are many slave narratives out there, and so they were very helpful to me, and maybe the most helpful of all.
What kind of information did you find in these memoirs?
Well, when you're researching as a novelist, it's a little different than if you're researching as a historian. I mean, how many dates and facts and sort of political truths or facts do you need to know as a novelist to set a story? Well, you need to know some. You need to know what's happening to people, what are the outright oppressions that are being carried out and so forth, what kind of things are being voted in parliaments or legislatures. But you also want to know things of a much more personal nature, like what are people wearing? What are people eating? How are they sleeping? You know, how many babies are they having? How are they catching babies? What techniques do they have to alleviate symptoms of sickness? What kind of herbal remedies are they using? How do they live on a day-to-day basis? And these elements of color and personality and sort of day-to-day life are really the things that you want to plunder as a novelist and use to your advantage, because if you just soak your reader in tons and tons of historical or political facts, nobody will want to turn a page. I sort of liken the research element to making homemade lemonade. You know, and the details in a novel are a bit like the sugar in homemade lemonade. If you put in too much, it's going to be so sickly sweet that nobody will want to drink it because it's just too sweet. It's just like syrup and it's yucky, you know. So nobody wants to engage in it. If you put in too little, it's not going to be attractive to drink. It's going to be too bitter. So you need just enough detail, as you have just enough sugar in homemade lemonade, so it's drinkable, so it's interesting to a reader or to a consumer of lemonade. And so, and you have to sort of look for verisimilitude of this, something that seems real, even if it's not. And so the details that I was looking for are often human, ordinary, day-to-day details. Again, what are people sleeping on? What are they wearing? What are they eating? What do they have around their necks when they're being walked 3 months from their home village to the sea to be sent off in a slave ship? What does the inside of that slave ship look like? How are they locked up in the slave ship? All these little daily details are the things that speak more to me as a novelist than the grand lines of politics.
And you had all these documents, all these memoirs, all this information and research. When you were writing your book, how did you know how you wanted to start your novel and how you wanted to end it? Was it the details that motivated you to start it a certain way or end it a certain way?
Well, I knew, I'm of the John Irving school of thought, that, and everybody's got a different way, and I don't think that my way of thinking is the way that other people should work. It just works for me. And that is that I couldn't possibly write a novel without knowing how it's going to end, or at least without thinking I know how it's going to end, because everything that I'm cooking up along the way is driving towards a certain conclusion. And so I do need to know, at least I need to think I know, how a book's going to end as I'm beginning it, because it shapes everything that comes along the way. I'm driving towards a point in the distance. I may not know quite how I'm going to get there, but I know I'm looking for that distant point. So knowing the end sort of shapes my journey, even if things change on the fly, as they always do. So I guess I just try to keep in mind that Aminata wants to go home, and she wants to return to the land that she's stolen from, and she's 11 years old when she's taken, and she's old enough to know who she is, and what her languages are, and who her parents were, and where she comes from, and what her religion is. And she's even had a bit of exposure to reading and writing in Arabic. She's seen the Quran. She's grounded. She's a young woman. You know, she's 11 and she's a young woman. She has womanly responsibilities already in her village. So she's old enough to know where she comes from. But she's young enough to have the faint hope of one day maybe returning home. So I guess what carried me was the idea that she's going to be sustained by hope of one day returning home.
And let's focus on the main character, Aminata. She's such a strong, relentless character in the book. Was it important for you to have this strong female character in order to tell the story?
It was, Nikki. I mean, I don't think anybody wants to read about a victim who's nothing but victimized. If she's captured, beaten, thrown into a slave ship, and killed, where's the story? I mean, of course, this happened to millions of people, but where's the story? How do you carry a reader through that? She has to have some ray of hope. She has to have some ability to act against her environment and show some, as they say, agency, some individualism, some possibility of surviving. It's her survival in the emotional and physical survival that makes her, I think, such an interesting character. And so I don't want to be falsely optimistic. I mean, we all know that millions of people died in the most atrocious conditions, didn't even make it across the ocean because they were transported in such, brutal and inhumane conditions. But if that happens to Aminata, where's the story? And so, yes, it was essential to me that she be strong and that she have the opportunity to survive, and not just physically, but emotionally, not turn into a rancorous, bitter, hateful person, but that she dig down and find, and search always for beauty in life, even in the horrid life that she's been forced to live.
And how did you create the vision for the character? She had the markings on her cheeks.
Yes,
and you gave her the certain qualities that you gave her. How did you sort of envision that character?
It's funny, I think looking at her and imagining how she stood and what she looked like, and the moons on her carved beautifully into her upper cheekbones, I think that's the first thing that came to me. Actually, I was looking at her and imagining Aminata and the way she stood and looked and sounded before I even knew her story. And it helped that I traveled several times to West Africa as a volunteer with Canadian Crossroads International. I lived in rural villages in Mali and Cameroon and Niger. And of course, Aminata is born in the country that later on becomes known as Mali. It's not known as Mali in the 1740s when she's born, but it's now known as Mali. And so living and working in and living with ordinary rural Africans in their homes and watching them live and sleeping in their homes and watching them eat and eating with them in sort of traditional ways made it easier for me to visualize a character such as Aminata, since I'd spent time in villages such as the one that I place her in fictionally.
Your book was very descriptive in the way you described the characters, the images you created. When I was reading your book, it wasn't like I was reading a book. It was like I was watching a film. I could see your characters, I could see the images, and like I could smell the smells that you described. So have you, or ever, would you ever consider turning the book into a film?
Well, I'd take the money and run very happily if somebody wanted to turn it into a film. It's not really my decision. If a filmmaker wants to option the book and then go from optioning it, which means purchasing the right to it for a little while, the right to exploit the book and turn it into a movie, and then you go from optioning it to turning it into a movie, I'll be delighted because first of all, frankly, I could use the money, and second of all, that would finance the writing of other books, and writers are always looking for ways to find the money, to keep writing. And so if somebody wants to offer a bucket of money, I just look at that as writing time. I can take that bucket or half bucket or whatever comes along, and I can use that to finance another year or 2 or 3 of writing. And so I'd be delighted to see it turn into a movie, and I'd be utterly pragmatic about it. And writers are always looking for sources of income, and if that happens, which I think is very a slim hope, but if it does happen, great.
And in retrospect, after having the novel completed, and you look at it now, if you could, would you add anything else to it?
Well, it's really recent, Nikki. I mean, I have had that feeling sometimes in looking over some of my earlier books. I can think of a specific scene in an earlier novel that I would change, or I wouldn't do the same way if I were to rewrite it now. But you always change as you go. I mean, my first novel came out 15 years ago. It's only normal that I wouldn't write it the way I wrote it then, and I wouldn't feel the need now to write the book I felt the need to write 15 years ago. So you write what you need to write. So I do feel entirely satisfied with the Book of Negroes. That doesn't mean to say that I think it's perfect or anything like that. The last thing that most writers walk around thinking is that the things they've done are perfect. I know that it's flawed, but I feel it's as good as I could make it. And it's only just come out a couple months ago, and so I don't have any regrets now about some horrible mistake or something I really mismanaged in the book. I'm sure I'll feel that a little later, but I feel good about it. And if I do, and when I do come upon scenes that I think aren't done as well as I wish they'd been done, in retrospect, rather than worrying about it, I'll just keep writing the next book. So I feel good about it. I feel that I gave the book all of my heart and all of my intellect, and I really put everything I had into the novel, so I don't think I could have made it any better when I finished it. I really gave it everything, so I feel happy with it, and that's important, to me.
And I just, lastly, I thought you'd like to know that at the Toronto Public Libraries, your book's on hold. There's 310 holds on your book, and your book's flying off the shelves in the bookstores. How does that make you feel?
Great, actually, great. It's I've had 7 books come out, and this is the first one that's flown off the shelves that much. I've had a couple modest bestsellers, which don't really amount to that much in reality. They're called bestsellers because they're on the bestseller list for a little bit of time or something. But this one seems to have really connected with people in ways that the other books didn't connect so viscerally and so immediately. So it's really gratifying, and I've been touring and speaking and giving interviews almost every day for just over 2 months now, and what I hope is that soon I'll sort of be able to slip into writing again and kind of disappear from so much public view and just start writing, because I need to invest in the thing that makes me what I am, and that's writing. And so it'd be totally self-destructive not to promote a book actively when you have the opportunity, because that's you don't want to spend 4 or 5 years on a book and then not give it a chance to sort of get some attention and attract some readers. But it's coming up time soon to start just settling down, spending some time by myself, and letting the imagination turn and to start writing again, and to do the things that make me who I am.
Thank you, and I'll pass it on to Matthew.
Thank you, Nikki.
One thing that I really enjoyed much about the book was the characters. I think you've already referred to it, they're not one-dimensional. All of them had many layers. It was easy, I think, considering that the topic that you're dealing with, it was easy to fall into one-dimensional characters. I mean, the slave master is one real person and so on. So I enjoyed that very much. And I want to ask you about one specific character that's something that was very curious to me, and I thought you might be able to clarify that for me. That was the character of Fanta, the youngest wife of the village chief, that also was on the slave ship, and then during the rebellion of the slaves on the ship, she grabbed her own child, killed the child, threw it overboard, and then she also grabbed one of the other slaves' child. And to me that was, I'm trying to understand it, and it's still something that was disturbing to me. Why did the character do that?
It's a pretty ugly scene, isn't it? It's a pretty horrible scene. Well, I had found to commit these horrible murders because I felt that she would be so boiling over with anger and hatred and rebellion that she just, the only way that she knew how to rebel was to lash out, and it's very hard to lash out against the people who control you, as they're not accessible, they're not easy to get to, they're not easy to kill, and so often hatred and anger is directed inward. I mean, they say that depression, which is an endemic illness, in our society, very widespread, is really hatred turned inward, is anger turned inward against oneself. They say that that's one of the definitions of depression, and we all know that millions of Canadians and people around the world suffer seriously from depression, so they have anger, but they turn it inwards, and rather than finding a more healthy channel to direct it toward. How many ways does Fonda have to express her anger? She's been ripped from her village while she's pregnant. She's lost her husband and her status in her village. She's lost a very senior status in her village. She's been humiliated and forced to walk virtually naked in chains for months overland to the sea as if she were some animal. And she's been treated as if she were an animal. And she hates and she wants to lash out. And she doesn't want to be the servant, or the slave or the property or the chattel of some people who purport to own her. And she wants to lash out. And so she chooses to kill her own child as well as another child, infant, a black infant that she finds nearby on the ship. It must be understood that this is not something that's purely imagined on my part. It has to be believable in the novel, and it's up to the reader to decide if it's believable or not. But many people jumped overboard so that they would not be taken as slaves, so that their last act of resistance was suicide because they would not be taken. Others killed each other, and all you have to do is look into communities now. People continue to this day to shoot and kill each other, their own brothers and sisters and people on the streets in various communities, including, of course, black communities. Murder within communities continues to go on now, and often domestic violence to this very day is often directed. Well, the word itself explains it. It's self-explanatory. Domestic violence is violence directed against your own family, your own people, which is probably one of the most pervasive forms of violence in our societies. Violence directed towards primarily women and children within the family, and so it's hardly a new phenomenon. It's been going on for, I'm sure, thousands of years, and so I felt it was realistic that this particular character, her outrage and her horror, would be directed inward to her own people and to her, her own child. I felt in her case it was believable, as horrible as it was.
But then also in the multi-dimensionality of the characters, where she was in her own society, she was almost in a sense a slave master herself, where they had what they called the Golozo.
Yes.
And she had, Fomba was the Golozo, and the way she approached him was like a slave. She would hit him and she would be very mean to him. And that's also something I really enjoyed, that multidimensionality.
Yes, well, Woloso is of course a word in Mamanakan, one of the African languages spoken in this village. Woloso is a word that means second generation slave, meaning that Fomba was born into slavery, meaning that his parents were slaves in this village. And one of the sad but undeniable truths about world history is that slavery has existed in many forms, really probably from just about the beginning of social organization. And it's a sad truth that slavery has existed in Africa for centuries and existed in other forms in African societies for centuries prior to the transatlantic slave trade. I'm not trying to equate slavery in Africa over the centuries with the transatlantic slave trade, which was one of the most heinous, oppressive, outrageous violations of humanity that the world's ever seen. So I'm not trying to equate what happened in Africa over the centuries, over the millennia, I guess, to the transatlantic slave trade, which was in its scale and its massiveness was unprecedented. Millions and millions of people stolen and murdered and captured and kidnapped and abused in these ways. But it doesn't serve us to deny that slavery had its own forms in African society, and that does add to, as you say, Matthew, to the multidimensionality of it, that in many ways people who are slave owners themselves, such as Fanta, end up becoming slaves. And I think it adds to the poignancy of her story.
Writing a story like this, to me it's almost impossible not to think about the present and the past and the link between it. And one of the characters that towards the end of the book, when they were already in Freetown, one of the characters that I thought you used as a kind of a voice to link the past and the present was Falconbridge's wife, Anna Maria. She had a little discussion with Aminata, where I thought she was almost like the voice of today. Did you intend it to be like that?
Well, that's a really interesting point. I wasn't so much thinking of her representing the voice of today. I was trying to sort of allow some of the arguments of the day that were voiced in support of slavery, in support of the institution, to be articulated, in her own words. And I was trying to give her the opportunity to express some of the things that were being said at that time in defense of slavery, while still trying to make her seem like a human being. She likes Aminata, she admires Aminata, but she does have a kind of a condescending, vaguely pro-slavery sort of attitude. And again, I'm attracted to that complexity. What's the point of making her a monstrous, horrible, awful person? What interest is that to the reader? So she has her humanity. She's vaguely pro-slavery in certain respects, but she's married to an abolitionist, and she respects Aminata and her prodigious intelligence, but still she has some qualities that are less attractive to me and I imagine to most readers. And so I wasn't so much thinking of linking her to today, but that's a really interesting point, and I guess in a way she does link us to today, and she does add a voice that sounds perhaps a little more modern day.
I think it was just some of the things he said is things that we still hear. Well, I've heard them. I mean, we also, by coincidence, in the week of the commemoration, 200-year commemoration of that act that brought to end the trade. And yesterday, you probably seen this.
Yes, I did. I read the whole article. Fascinating.
Well, is this the Aminata of today? Because there's one scene in your book where Aminata was in the church in London. When she went to church with the abolitionists, and she also fainted there.
Yes.
And now you didn't say which church it was, but was this perhaps Westminster? And again, to me, it created another link. And that's also why I thought, what does your book say for today's society, for today's issues? Or should we not try and make it so complicated, the book?
Should we not try to make it so complicated?
In terms of trying to read in it more than it is. Did you ever intend it to also say something about the problems that still exist in societies today, or was it just a story?
Well, of course I hope that it reflects on us, and I hope that it does much more than provide a reader a glimpse into the past. I certainly hope that it leads a reader to think and wonder about injustice and oppression and slavery right here, today. Experts around the world estimate, and I'm not an expert about modern-day slavery, but I've heard many of them interviewed recently, in the last week or two on CBC and in other outlets, and experts about modern-day slavery estimate that as many as 20 or 30 million people, contemporary people, are held, women and children especially, are held as slaves now in Canada, in the United States, and in various other countries in South Asia and Africa and so forth. Often this takes the form of bonded labor. Sometimes they're sort of placed in conditions of providing sexual services and are not free to walk. often it's enforced labor, and the definition of modern-day slavery seems to be, can the person who's kept in a forced situation where they're required to work and to serve somebody for somebody's profit, are they allowed to stand up and leave? Can they walk? Even if it's to a worse situation, can they have their own volition, stand up and say, I'm out of here, I'm going? And if they cannot leave, if they're forced physically and through violence to stay where they are, that's modern-day slavery. That is slavery of the 21st century variety. And it's estimated that upwards of 20 million people, women and children especially, are kept in these conditions, which is horrid. So absolutely, I hope that there's a modern-day link. Absolutely, I hope that the injustices in this book reverberate, forward in time to contemporary times. We all have an obligation to try to make our world better, and to try to be just, decent people who don't just act decent in our own private lives, but who advocate for justice and for the respect of other human beings around the planet. And so I think that the book connects us to the modern day in various ways, and it doesn't take that much imagination to leap from the slavery of the transatlantic times in the 18th century to modern day slavery. Maybe that'll be my next book.
At the beginning of the interview, you referred to the fact that you've had black audiences, white audiences, mixed audiences. Was there a difference in reactions or responses from these different types of audiences to the book?
I couldn't say that I've found one. I think that occasionally, and I think very understandably, occasionally I imagine, or I suspect, or perhaps I fear, that some black women may come to this book and may come to, say, a reading that I'm going to give with a little bit of skepticism. Well, who's this guy and how does he think he can write in the voice of an African woman? And is this going to be complete nonsense? Am I going to feel respected? Am I going to feel that I can respect this book and that this book respects me and my history? Or is this going to be yet another, ridiculously stereotyped, inappropriate description of, black women or black people at the hands of somebody who shouldn't be doing it? So I certainly sometimes fear or might anticipate that reaction. And I'm often asked by people, of various racial backgrounds, not just black or white or Asian, but all sorts of people ask, why did you choose to write this write this novel in the voice of an African woman, and a woman in particular? Why did you do that? But people are usually interested in accepting of my answer, and on the whole, I couldn't say that I found myself encountering different questions or receptions at the hands of different audiences. On the whole, people have been quite receptive and quite intrigued. But Canadians are, on the whole, pretty polite. And most people, if you're speaking to a room of 40 people and 2 or 3 of them just hate the book and just can't stand it, they're unlikely to stand up and tell you that they hate it. They probably would keep that to themselves. And I'm sure some people will really dislike it. You can't put out a book and have everybody love it. But most people who talk to you are interested. And if they don't talk to you, well, you don't really know what they're really thinking. So the reception has really been, on the whole, very positive, and that's from all backgrounds, people who come to talk to me.
I was able to talk to you quite a while longer about it because I really enjoyed it, but I think my time is over, and we will now have questions from the floor. Is that correct? Anybody?
Well, thank you, by the way. I really enjoyed those questions. Matthew, Jessica, and Nikki. And I was mentioning to your teacher beforehand that I find that often questions from students are the most informed, thoughtful, detailed, articulate questions that I encounter when I'm giving interviews to the media. And that's primarily because students on the whole take the time to actually read and think about the book before they start asking questions. And most people in working media don't take or have the time to do that. And so invariably, the questions are more interesting and thoughtful and engaging, from students. So thank you.
Thank you. So let's open it up to the floor. What questions do you have?
Yes.
Jessica was mentioning the book A Deserter's Tale. I just wondered how you found working with Joshua Key, writing his story.
fascinating. And here I was finishing one novel, you know, told in the voice of an African woman in the 18th century, and starting and then rushing through to finish another book told in the voice of a white Oklahoma farm boy who grows up in his trailer, as poor as any white Americans can be, and completely dirt poor. I mean, he's growing up in a trailer in an isolated, pretty well useless farm in the middle of nowhere in Oklahoma, and he has to cope with tremendous abuses that he's required to carry out against Iraqi civilians, you know, in Iraq. His job as a private in the American Army is to basically blow up the doors of the homes of Iraqi civilians and traumatize the civilians in their homes. And never does he deal with any enemy targets or people who are armed and fighting. All of the victims of their aggressions are unarmed Iraqi civilians, men, women, and children, all of them, 100%. And so it was really fascinating to write in his voice. And basically, I just interviewed him for weeks and had hundreds of hours of tapes and hundreds of pages of notes taken, a week in BC, every day, all day for a week in Saskatchewan, every day, all day for a week, and then a week in my home in Burlington. And then after interviewing him about everything I could possibly think of over and over again, I just started to assemble all these notes and find a way to write his story in what seemed to be the right voice for him. And sort of build the story from the ground up, put away my notes and start to write, and then work with him to shape the story and make sure that there weren't any mistakes and that everything was as accurate as humanly possible. So it was actually very thrilling. It was really interesting, and it was so different from the working on a novel. And in the end, I was working on them both because they were both due the same day. It was a very stressful time in my life to have two books due on the same day, and in two so very different books. And so I work on one like crazy for 2 or 3 weeks, and then put it aside, and then work like a madman on the other for 2 or 3 weeks, and put it aside, and go back. And the transitions were always difficult. To get back into the other story always took a few days. So I'd work until I had something to give to my publisher, and then I'd turn back to the other one, and until I had something more to give to that publisher. And they were going to different publishers. So it was thrilling and really interesting, but very, very stressful. I don't ever want to have two books due on the same day again. Yes?
Actually, Adam just asked the very question I was going to ask. But how did you come to write that book? Like, were you approached to write that book, or and you know, you mentioned that you like to you know, you write for yourself, primarily for yourself. Was there something, were you approached, or was that something you were interested in pursuing? How did you come to write The Deserter's Tale?
Well, I was. I'll show you what it looks like. Those of you who haven't seen it, but I was sitting in my car, going to a FedEx office in Burlington, where I live, and I was listening to the Joshua Key on the radio. Anna Maria Tremonti on the Current was talking to him about his experiences at war, and I'd never heard of this guy. And I was so fascinated by the interview that I sat there in the car, turned off the ignition, then switched it back onto the battery power to listen to the rest of the interview instead of going into the FedEx office. So I sat there in the parking lot. I mean, it happens to me maybe once a year, or once every 2 years. And the interview was so engaging on the radio that I just can't miss it. And so I sat there listening to the rest of the interview. It was a long interview. It was one of those rambling interviews where the person gave him a lot of time. Maybe it was 20 minutes or something like that, 25 minutes. And he was just so interesting. And I came home and talked to my wife about it, and how engaging he was. He struck me as sort of a modern-day white boy version of Muhammad Ali, in the sense that he was speaking from his personal experience. He's not a politician, he's not an intellectual, he's not a writer. He'd been to war, and he'd seen the most horrible things, and he was speaking from deeply personally experienced things, and so his words just seemed incontrovertible. They seemed so true and so believable, because he spoke from his own experiences at war. And I was talking about this, and a week later I got an email from my agent, who'd sent my literary agent, whose job is to sell my books to publishers. Agents take about a 15% commission on your sale, so her job is to sell my books when I've got them ready to pitch, or book ideas when I'm ready to pitch a book idea to a publisher. And all nonfiction books are written from a proposal. They're not, you don't write the whole book and then try to sell it. You write a proposal, a sample chapter and a few pages, and you sell the proposal. That's how it works. So she asked a whole bunch of writers in her stable of writers if anybody wanted to write the Joshua Key book. And I just jumped. And I shouldn't have, because I was still working on the Book of Negroes. It was still due, and I hadn't finished the rewrite. So I had no business compromising my commitment to the Book of Negroes and going on and taking on another project. But one, the just fascinated me. And two, I was kind of delighted to step outside of the realm of the black experience and just do something new and free and liberating. And three, the story just, I felt so passionate about it that I really, really wanted it. And so I just jumped up and said, I want to do this. And I said why and how I thought I would do it and why I felt I was qualified. It helped to be experienced as a journalist and having worked as a journalist for several years. And it helped to be experienced as a nonfiction writer as well. But I tried to take it as a novel and try to imagine his voice with a novelistic eye.
And through that book, like, you know, there's a lot of parallels, like in the Vietnam War, we were basically granting, you know, you were getting landed immigrant status in Canada basically at the border, and we were just accepting all these deserters from Vietnam. That's not happening now. They're all fighting for refugee status. Were you trying to advocate on behalf of war resistors through that book? Because, you know, all their refugee claims have been denied so far.
And I think that's atrocious. And I certainly would advocate and do advocate on behalf of the rights of war resistors. I do think that the Canadian government should let war resistors who fled the war come to Canada, probably being among our most productive and engaged citizens. Many people who were draft dodgers from the Vietnam era have become very passionate, engaged, constructive, positive citizens, and they bring all their passions with them. So I am an advocate on behalf of the war resistors. I didn't take on the book to take on an advocacy role generally, but I certainly consider myself an advocate, especially having discovered Joshua's story. Is the book a work of advocacy on behalf of war resistors? Well, in a way. I mean, that's not its primary objective. It tells Joshua's story. To me, I think it's obvious that the Canadian government should allow him to stay, and he has a great deal to give. He and his family members have a great deal to give to this country and have every right to stay. And he shouldn't be forced to return to war and to continue to violate the Geneva Conventions by abusing civilians at war. You're not supposed to train your guns on civilians. That's one of the primary rules of the Geneva Conventions. You don't go after women and children and unarmed people of any gender or age. You do not attack civilians, and that's what they did day after day after day. So I feel that forcing him to return to war or making him go to jail because he wouldn't violate the Geneva Conventions any longer, I think is a crime against humanity in itself. So I feel he should be allowed to stay. So yes, I guess you could consider me an advocate on behalf of the war resistors, but I didn't write the book particularly as an advocacy act on behalf of the war resistors. I think it just is a natural byproduct of my engagement with Joshua Key's story. Yes?
I just wanted to ask, with reference to the Book of Negroes, you said that you understand that it's probably going to be a book that some people don't like or don't enjoy. And I'm just wondering, from a writer's point of view, is there such a thing as negative feedback?
Oh, yeah. I mean, some people say any press or any coverage is good coverage. I wouldn't go quite that far. If your book comes out and it is hammered, you know, in the media, just absolutely hammered or vilified, then that's not going to help your sales, and it's going to act as a disincentive to booksellers and to librarians and to others to stock the book or to place it. And so the media reaction to your book, I think, can have a huge impact on its sales. And obviously, it's not for no reason that in the months before your book comes out, hundreds of copies of that book in bound galley form are sent out to media, because you want to create some buzz and some hype, and you hope that the buzz and the hype is going to be positive. So yes, I think there's such a thing as negative coverage, and I'm not saying that one review or two that are bad will sink something, but if the overall reaction is really negative, or if the media just are not interested at all, then it can very much compromise your possibilities of reaching a broader market and having sales.
Have you found that the negative feedback, is it more to do with the subject matter and the way you told it, or is it more to do with writing the book?
Well, to be perfectly honest, and believe me, I've had some very negative reviews in my life, so I know the feeling of having seen some of my books really hammered. It may be legitimately. It's not like everything you write is perfect and there's not room for criticism. I'm perfectly willing to take criticism, and I'm sure a lot of it is well-deserved and has its merits. I haven't actually seen any negative reviews of the Book of Negroes yet. I'm sure they'll come, but I haven't seen any. All of the reviews, literally all of the reviews that I've seen so far of the Book of Negroes have been glowing and positive. And so it's coming out in the States in November. We'll see how the Americans react to it. It may be a much more mixed thing. I find that my nonfiction books much more mixed receptions than the novels. I came out with a book 5 years ago called Blackberry Sweet Juice on Being Black and White in Canada. It was a memoir about what it was like to grow up in Don Mills, very close to here, in a family that was black and white, in a community that was almost entirely white, or virtually entirely white, except for our family. So it was a memoir about mixed race identity, and where did I fit in, how did I see myself, at what point did I begin to see myself as black, how did I assert that sense of blackness, how did I grow into a sense of racial identity through my teen years. And so that was a meditative sort of memoir about racial identity. And that book attracted incredibly mixed responses. Some people loved it, other people just hated it. And so the reviews reflected the generally sort of mixed response to the book. The Joshua Key book called The Deserter's Tale, it too has run into mixed responses, but I was anticipating that. I mean, in many ways, I guess the book about being of mixed race identity might have been considered to be sensational in that the topics that it explored were often very controversial. But in this book too, I mean, I think that the reaction to a book about a deserter from the Iraq War is largely going to be predicated on the reader's politics. And in Canada, as in the United States, feelings are very polarized about the war in Iraq. Some people are adamantly opposed to it, and some people are adamantly in favor of it. And I think that your general philosophy about the war in Iraq is going to influence profoundly your response to this book. So I was naturally expecting that some people would just hate it, and other people would find it very inspiring and interesting and engaging. And it would be unrealistic to anticipate otherwise. And part of the job of surviving as a writer, whether it's your first book that you're coming out with, or in this case your seventh, is to have a tough skin and to be tough, because people are always going to be telling you no, or criticizing you, or saying something negative about you, or saying that your work is crap. And you have to hang on and keep going, because if you fold and just give up, the first time somebody tells you that you can't get in the door, or that your work's not good enough, or that you're not good enough, then you'll never really get anywhere. And so I think part of surviving as a writer, whether it's your first newspaper article, or your first book, or your 10th book, is just having a tough skin and believing deep down in yourself. Because you'll always have people trying to slap you down, whether you're a beginner, or whether you're an experienced and established writer. And you have to believe in yourself, or you won't be able to keep going. So I do anticipate, negative coverage, especially of books like the book about Iraq, and that's part of the game, and it's fair game. I mean, you put out a book, some people will really dislike it.
I wanted to ask about Aminata and your decision to have her be a baby catcher.
Yes. Well, a baby catcher is, of course, a word that she uses for a midwife. Anybody who's traveled in rural, traditional West African society will see what I saw, and that is that children travel with their mothers. Where the mother goes, the baby goes, because the baby's on the mother's back. And whether that woman is a nurse or is working in the fields, that baby's going where she's going. You can go into hospitals in rural West African countries and find babies traveling with their mothers who are nurses working in those hospitals. Babies travel with their mothers. And so Aminata is a daughter of a midwife. So she naturally learns from an early age the skills and the trade that her mother carries out. So when her mother goes to catch a baby, Aminata goes along on her mother's back when she's an infant, and then as a toddler walking, and then as a young girl. So she learns the skills of midwifery from the earliest age because she's her mother's helper. And so this is her trade that she learns from her childhood. So by the time she's 11, she's actually quite skilled with her hands and is quite proficient at catching babies, even though she's never, of course, had one herself since she's only 11. I'm interested in the fact that the sad, paradoxical, horrible fact that Aminata will catch other people's babies but have to lose her own. And this is the truth of her life. And the poignancy of losing her own, I think, is underscored by the fact that she has caught and will continue to have to catch the babies of other women, even though she can't hold on to her own children because of the slave society that she's brought into and the fact that she's divided from her, split off from her children. So I guess I was attracted to it because it's fascinated me, and also it just seemed to be another way to underscore and dramatize a woman's story. This could not be a man's story. This has to be a woman's story. So was quite interested in it. Some of my children were born by, with the assistance of midwives, and I've always been interested in the role of midwives. My wife wrote a book about midwifery in Canada, and her children were a blended family, so her children were born with the help of midwives as well. So I'm interested in midwifery, and I'm interested in herbal and traditional older forms of midwifery as well, and read a lot about it as I was researching the novel.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes, Matthew.
One thing that fascinated me in the book is by the time that we reached the stage of the story when she was coming to Nova Scotia, I thought I've experienced everything in terms of the desperation, all the horrible things that could have happened. But to me, that period in Nova Scotia was almost the worst part. Wherever she went in the other places in the US, there was like contact between the slaves and the slaveholders, the masters. But in Canada, there was this complete bleakness, the separation. The blacks here, the loyalists here, and to me that was absolutely an astounding part of the book. And I just wondered, is there more room to explore this through writing? It's almost as if it's something that's not told really, because
Well, yes, is there more room? Of course. I'm just one voice and I'm one person, and I'm sure there are many more books to be written, or that could or should be written, about the experience of the blacks of Nova Scotia and the black loyalists. I am also interested in the irony that black people who fled the United States and who fled slavery in the United States to come to Canada as black loyalists, seeking the promised land, thinking that they were coming to a land that would secure their freedom forever, not ever anticipating they would have to leave, ended up, many of them, feeling that they'd never encountered such wretched and abysmal and oppressive living conditions as they had in Canada. And that sort of shatters the Canadian dream a little bit, doesn't it? I mean, we like to think of ourselves in a morally superior way. We like to point a finger at those nasty Americans who were doing all those dastardly things south of the border, and how much better we are, and how much more noble we are in our history and in our morality. And I think that's a very dangerous and self-serving attitude. Why is it dangerous? Because it prevents us from really looking honestly at ourselves. I'm a proud Canadian, and I think Canada is in many ways a fantastic country, and I was born here, and I happily stay here. I travel happily as well and visit other countries with great interest, but I happily remain a Canadian as a matter of choice. But I don't think it serves us to pretend to ourselves that we have some mythic, morally superior past in which we were nothing but great bestowers of benevolence upon all those who came to our lands. We did welcome some people, and we did chase others out. And so I think that it's accurate to my understanding of history that many of the blacks who came to Nova Scotia would have felt that they had never endured such oppression and such difficulty as they did in Nova Scotia. And you're entirely right, Matthew. The segregation of early Nova Scotian society was abysmal and was entrenched. And if you were black in, say, Shelburne, Birchtown area in the South Shore of Nova Scotia, you were not allowed to live in the town where the white loyalists lived unless you were one of their slaves. And we had slavery and freedom coexisting in Nova Scotian society, because in the Book of Negroes, these 3,000 people who come, black people who flee Manhattan and come to Nova Scotia, some of them are free, traveling, as they say, on their own bottom. That's the term they use. Some of them are indentured, which is sort of a halfway status between freedom and slavery. And some of them are slaves, traveling as a property of British military officers who had slaves during the war and brought their slaves with them from Manhattan to Nova Scotia. And so you have various categories of economic and social status of blacks in Nova Scotia at the time: free, indentured, and enslaved. And you cannot live as a free black in Shelburne. You've got to go to the dog's ass of the harbor, as they called it, to Birchtown, a few miles down the road, and live there in desperately poor conditions. And so it was a rigidly segregated society. So I feel that that's something that deserved depiction and dramatization. And it's stunning and disturbing for Canadians, but also I feel interesting. I mean, you have to think, if 1,200 black people turned around after 10 years in Canada and left in 15 ships, an extremely dangerous thing to do, to sail across the ocean from Halifax to Sierra Leone against the tide of slave traffic, risking their lives to sail that ocean. Why are they risking their lives? Because there are pirates plying the oceans. At any time, any of these puny, unarmed ships could have been overtaken by pirates, and the people in these ships could have been retaken and resold into slavery. So they're traveling at great personal risk. Why would they do this if they didn't feel utterly disenchanted with their lives in Nova Scotia? They were not changing their lives and traveling across the ocean on a whim. They're undertaking huge risks because they were so utterly disappointed with and full of disgust with their treatment in Nova Scotian society.
But that also brings us to a brilliant part of the book, the whole issue, the theme in the book about identity. She came from Africa. She saw herself in Africa. Then she went to Nova Scotia and she was seen as a royalist. Then she went to Africa and she was seen as a Nova Scotian. And the people that went to Africa came in Africa and they realized, but we're not really African anymore, we're something else now. And the Africans in Africa told them, but you are whites. What's the word they used?
Suba?
Yeah. They just saw them as a different kind of, and I found that interesting, that whole thread in the book about identity.
Yes. Well, you know, I grew up in Don Mills, nearby here, and I mean, I'm a Canadian, black heritage and white, an Anglophone who's learned a couple other languages, French and Spanish, and but I never thought of myself as an Anglo growing up in Don Mills. The last word in the world I would have used to describe myself if somebody said, could you use 3 or 4 descriptors to describe yourself? As a 17-year-old kid in Don Mills, would I have called myself an Anglo? No way. But I moved to Quebec City to do finish my undergraduate degree in economics at Laval University. Suddenly I became an Anglo. I wasn't even black, I was an Anglo in Quebec City. That was the strangest word in the world. What point am I trying to make? Who you are and how you're seen often depends hugely on where you live. And I'll give you an example of this. In my book, Blackberry Sweet Juice, which was this meditation on mixed race identity, I not only wrote about my own experiences, but I interviewed 34 other people in Canada who, like me, have 1 black and 1 white parent. And I asked them all sorts of questions about who they were, how they saw themselves, how they managed their hair, when they started thinking about their identity, everything, personal, intimate, mundane, political, I asked everything. It was a really interesting voyage to speak to 34 other people across the country, from Victoria to Halifax, about their experiences growing up in mixed-race families with 1 black and 1 white parent. And one young woman that I spoke to was born in Swaziland. And in Swaziland, her parents and she were considered to be colored. That was a formal, rigid social definition akin to the definitions that existed during the apartheid regime in South Africa. They were defined as colored. Colored, of course, had to do with being racially mixed, perhaps some Indian, some black, some white in you. And they were defined as being socially superior to blacks. And the last thing in the world that Cindy's parents thought of themselves of as black, and the last thing in the world that Cindy thought of herself as was black when she was growing up in Swaziland. When she was about 8 or 9, her family immigrates to Saskatchewan, a small village, not even Saskatoon, but a small village in Saskatchewan. And a couple of years after arriving in Saskatchewan, in this village, she's sent to a milk store to get some milk by her mother, and she walked in the store and some kid calls her a nigger. And so suddenly, this kid who thought she was colored and most definitely not black in Swaziland becomes a black in the most derogatory sense of the word in Saskatchewan. And so this kid who would have grown up as colored in Swaziland ends up embracing and very firmly, adamantly thinking of herself as now a young woman in Canada as black. And so part of this has to do with crossing the ocean and coming to a new place and being seen differently and thereby seeing yourself differently. But I would argue that you don't have to cross an ocean to have a massive sea change in your identity. You can change high schools. You can go from one high school here, 10 miles down the road to this high school in the same city and be seen very differently, but be treated differently. Your own self-perception can change. And so I think that geography and environment has a huge thing to do with how you see yourself and how others see you. And so Aminata, as she travels around the world, is seen differently in each place she goes, which I think is kind of interesting and natural, and it fascinates me. So yes, I am very interested in identity, and I think that identity is a fluid thing. You know, I'm not just a black person. You know, I'm a lot of things. I'm also of white ancestry. I'm a marathon runner. I'm a writer. I'm a father. You know, I brush my teeth in the morning. There's 1,000 things that make me who I am, and those things are fluid. And who you are and how you see yourself depends often on how you engage with society. If you're off on a desert island by yourself with nothing but fruit to pick from the trees to survive, and there's not one other human being there, then all these issues of identity fall away pretty quickly. Your identity comes into play when you're engaging with other people. So Aminata engages with different people in different parts of the world, and that creates a fluid and changing sense of identity for her.
Are there any other questions?
What's next for you?
I want to write a novel that requires not 1 second of research. I did a lot of research for this novel and a lot for my last novel, which is called Any Known Blood. But I'd like to write a contemporary novel about a person in a society like Canada. It doesn't necessarily have to be Canada. I think it might be an unnamed society. And this person is stateless. There are thousands and thousands of people in Canada, millions in the States, millions in Europe. I'm mentioning a few, developed continents or nations, economically developed, where many people have no legal status. They are not Canadians. They have lost the legal status to return where they came from, maybe for political reasons. They have no passports. Maybe they cannot return home because they'd be oppressed or imprisoned or perhaps killed if they did return home, if they've come from nations that they've had to flee for one reason or another. And although there are landed immigrants and there are formal refugees in Canada, there are also thousands and thousands of people in this city who have no papers and are under the radar screen and who live without any formal documentation. I'm interested in dramatizing the life of a person like that in a place like Canada. What does that life look like when you have no formal belonging and you have to live perennially under the radar screen? How does that life flesh out? I don't really think of it so much as a political novel, but a novel that explores a personal predicament with a political underpinning. And so I'm interested in exploring and dramatizing the life of a person with no formal status in a country like Canada and with no hope of a formal status. You're welcome. Would you buy it? Have a title for me? No.
Maybe I'm doing the thing. Am I? Am I doing the thing? Yes. Larry, I'm so appreciative of you taking the time to come in today because I know you've got an incredibly busy schedule. I was talking to Larry's wife and she was trying to help me fit him into our schedule, and this is what we came up with, and I'm just really grateful. I loved reading the book. As I told you, I just found it absolutely fascinating. And the last couple of nights, I've been dreaming of all your characters and that ship. Oh, it haunts me, just the smells and everything. So that's not a happy part, but the rest. So I'm really deeply affected when